Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Daily Audio Stash is where responsible marijuana smokers listen in on the latest news about cannabis, hear the voices of the marijuana law reform movement in special segments and interviews, and kick back with comedy and music no other podcast can offer. It's NORML's Daily Audio Stash. More information at normalaudiostash.com. First up today, it's news from NORML. Our news today. California Supreme Court expands medical marijuana defense. California medical marijuana patients may use a compassionate use defense if authorities attempt to prosecute them for transporting more than 1 pound of marijuana. The California Supreme Court ruled Monday 6-1 that if a medical marijuana patient can prove the quantity which they possess is consistent with their medical needs, then they may transport that amount on their person or in their vehicle. The case stemmed from the 2001 arrest of Sean Eric Wright after he was searched by Huntington Beach police officers at a local car wash. Police turned up over 1 pound of marijuana in several different containers and charged Wright with intent to distribute as well as transportation. Wright's doctor testified at his trial that the patient used edible cannabis, which requires greater amounts of marijuana than smoking, and that 1 pound of marijuana represented an approximately 3-month supply. The original trial judge denied the compassionate use defense allowable under Proposition 215 and California SB 420, claiming that the quantity involved was too great for such a defense to be considered. SB 420 offers medical use quantity guidelines. In the appeal, the California State Attorney General again made issue with the quantity Wright possessed, but the Supreme Court, in the majority opinion, stated, quote, "The sponsors of Senate Bill 420 made clear that, although couched in mandatory terms, the amounts set forth in Section 11362.77, Subdivision A, were intended to, quote, be a threshold, not the ceiling," close quote. The case is the latest victory for medical marijuana patients in California. Earlier this year, Americans for Safe Access won a lawsuit against the California Highway Patrol, requiring the CHP to let medical patients keep their medicine if it is found during a routine traffic stop. Last week, the only legal challenge to Proposition 215 by the San Diego County Board of Supervisors was found to be without merit in a tentative Superior Court ruling. Welcome back to the Audio Stash today. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. Just visit NORML.org. Today on the Audio Stash, we'll speak with Washington State's ACLU Legislative Reform Coordinator Jennifer Shaw about the recent Washington State Supreme Court ruling regarding a medical marijuana patient there. Also, we'll have our regular conversation with Dr. Mitch Earlywine regarding the science of marijuana. And stay tuned today, we have a couple of new PSAs as well as some great music from podshow.com. Check out everything on our website along with new NORML holiday gifts. Just visit normalaudiostash.com. We got a great new public service announcement in today from the Smart Bomb radio production crew.
Hey, how's it going? My name's Will. I don't work at a used record store. I don't own an iguana, although I'm sure they make great pets. I don't have dreadlocks or play the acoustic guitar. I can remember quite well, thank you, and no, I don't constantly have the munchies. When 420 comes around, I've still got 40 minutes of work left. I've never hit a girl on a bike with my car or shot my friend with a shotgun. I've never had to apologize for letting a girl I was watching drown in a pool while I was getting high because, duh, I wouldn't be getting high if I was around children. I'm a regular guy who works regular jobs, just like the majority of all Americans who use marijuana occasionally and responsibly. My name is Will, and I'm normal.
That was a public service announcement from the Smart Bomb Radio production crew. If you'd like to make a PSA to air here on the Normal Podcast, give us a contact and an email at podcast@norml.org. Thanks again to Smart Bomb Radio. Wednesdays here on the Audio Stash, we have the privilege of discussing recent medical and scientific issues regarding marijuana with Dr. Mitch Earlywine, professor of psychology at State University of New York and member of NORML's advisory board. Mitch is the author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book Pot Politics. We have links to the books at normalaudiostash.com. Mitch, welcome back to the Audio Stash today.
Great to be here.
Mitch, there is this fascinating study published this week regarding individuals who've been diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and who are also dealing with an addiction to cocaine. The researchers in this study found that intermittent cannabis use actually helped many of the individuals to stay off of cocaine and had a better rate of treatment retention. First, Mitch, tell us what ADHD is and its effects.
Well, this is a curious idea that maybe a little bit of marijuana use could help people stay away from cocaine, and particularly in a sample with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That disorder is essentially an under-arousal of parts of the brain, and people who are suffering from this disorder tend to go out and look for extra stimulation in order to get their brains fired up enough to sort of make it through their day and focus and do what they need to do. So you can imagine these are people who are at risk for stimulant abuse, and a lot of the medications that are used to treat this disorder are stimulants too, things like Ritalin, Adderall, and basically other amphetamines.
Mitch, when patients are taking Ritalin as they were in this study group, is cannabis working together with the Ritalin or working against it? How could they be interacting chemically?
The cannabinoid system is pretty far from the standard dopamine system that the Ritalin and other ADHD drugs often work on, and so it's just unclear. We just don't have the data. A lot of folks report that their response to cannabis is to have their attention kind of focused down for them, that it's easier for them to ignore certain distractors, but we just don't have enough data on cannabis as far as that kind of work goes.
Mitch, in this study, they found it was the intermittent users of cannabis who had the best success rate for dealing with their cocaine addiction, as opposed to those who abstained completely or used very frequently. What could be happening here to make that group of intermittent users find such success?
It's hard to guess just from a single study, but I think what often happens is if you're a cocaine addict and you've got a bit of cannabis use to look forward to down the line, perhaps it's easier to stay away from cocaine dealers or difficult situations where you might be tempted to use cocaine. Yet people who smoke marijuana constantly are clearly not making enough of a commitment to stay away from drugs in general. I think the folks who are completely abstinent, who are sort of following the letter of the law of the United States' approach to a drug-free America, if you will, actually end up putting themselves through a little extra stress, and they don't seem to have something else to kind of look forward to and may find themselves more likely to relapse.
And when we discuss ADHD patients, dopamine levels are part of the common language. Does the cannabinoid receptor system affect dopamine?
Although we hear it a lot from the drug czar's office, and there is a modest increase in dopamine levels downstream from cannabis use, it's nothing like the methylphenidate, the Ritalin that they were already on, or drugs that are much more dopaminergic like cocaine and amphetamine. So I think it may be enhancing some of that function, but there may be a whole lot going on in the cannabinoid system that we really just don't understand or know about.
And Mitch, could there be any particular increase in addiction risk for ADHD patients who use cannabis beyond what they're already predisposed to due to their condition?
Generally, folks with ADHD are at risk for alcohol and drug use, so they're clearly out there searching for something to help with their symptoms, and a lot of folks come across cannabis as a way of doing that. I knew a number of cannabis users medicinally with ADHD out in California. It may not be the first treatment of choice, but it's definitely something that people do. I want to point out, just based on stuff that we had discussed before, these are also clients who had a cognitive behavioral therapy as part of their treatment for the cocaine problems as well. And we've discussed before how cannabis may give you certain insights into how your cognitions and thoughts relate to your feelings, and maybe there's a little bit of that going on as well.
And Mitch, along those lines of cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the things that struck me in the conclusion to this study is that the researchers opined that clinicians should not ignore cannabis use in their patients because it could give the wrong impression about drug use overall. Can a behavior therapist really send those signals by putting aside patients' cannabis use?
I think it's a tough situation in part for the editors of this journal and for the people who did this research, and this is only a 14-week study. When you look at 1-year and 2-year follow-up data for folks with opiates and with cocaine dependence, using cannabis often does predict problems later on down the line. And so without the long-term follow-up data, it's just hard to know if this is going to hold up. Nevertheless, in my heart of hearts, I can't imagine that the idea that, if you get high on occasion, you're suddenly going to find yourself back addicted to cocaine is quite as completely destined as some of the disease model folks have led us to believe over the years here in the United States and in treatment communities.
In your opinion, Mitch, and I have to ask, this sample group is already being treated with Ritalin. How does cannabis compare to the drug Ritalin in the chemical effect on the body and the overall effect on the individual?
Well, it's markedly less dramatic. Ritalin has a toxic dose, has pretty dramatic stimulant effects. Cannabis doesn't have a lethal dose and doesn't seem to have the same level of stimulation at all. There is an intoxication associated with cannabis, and nobody's going to deny that. But Ritalin, particularly at high doses, also has wild stimulating effects that are, not something even as simple as a cup of coffee. So, the idea that one drug is okay and one drug is not, based on whether it creates a change in mental state, is clearly unclear in the comparison between these two drugs.
When you talk about that effect of Ritalin, why are those intense effects of those types of drugs not labeled as intoxication?
What's funny, particularly about the stimulants here in the United States, is we think that any change of state that increases productivity doesn't count, right? Uh-huh. Nicotine, nobody complains about. Caffeine, nobody really complains about. And Ritalin, nobody really complains about. Because here's something that actually makes you work harder. If a drug might actually make you enjoy working less, we find that inherently evil and never want to see that get into the legal pharmacopoeia.
That's amazing, Mitch, and a telling part of our culture there. Back to the specific study, when we look at individuals with ADHD, this group is really the most likely to have any type of addiction because of their brain chemistry. Is that correct?
Absolutely. These are folks who are at high risk, and among, the cocaine dependent, the ADHD cocaine dependent people are at more risk for relapse than even folks with just regular cocaine dependence.
This isn't the first study to examine those addicted to serious drugs and that they perform better in their treatment when those patients also use moderate amounts of cannabis. So could there be an argument here, Mitch, for including cannabis more formally into the addiction treatment regimen in places like California where there is medical marijuana and a medical marijuana structure?
I think we get back to some of our consistent messages about moderation in all things. I think intermittent use of cannabis or low-dose uses of cannabis has all kinds of medical potential and could even help folks decrease their dosage on something like Ritalin. I have folks who, use Ritalin only in certain times of the year and give themselves a little break from it in times when they aren't working as intensely, and they seem to experience, in a sense, no tolerance and none of the deficits that are usually associated with long-term stimulant use. And so this is something to really keep in mind. I just wish we had, the money and other resources in order to investigate this kind of work.
Mitch, the scientists who conducted this study are from Columbia University's Department of Psychology and from the New York Psychiatric Institute. Why are they approaching this topic? Is it just that cannabis is so very prevalent in all slices of American society that it just cannot be ignored scientifically any longer?
I have to be candid, Chris. I'm a Columbia grad myself, so I, of course, think it's because the institution is so wonderful. But, in fact, I think what's happened because of some previous data with opiate addicts, doing better if they had some intermittent use of cannabis. This seemed like a completely reasonable empirical question. And so folks are now looking and finding that the supposed disaster that was supposed to be associated with cannabis use during treatment for hard drug problems is no longer the disaster we once thought it was.
The conclusion in this study certainly sits on the fence in saying, well, clinicians shouldn't ignore cannabis use in patients, but it really doesn't do any harm, even might do some good regarding these ADHD patients. So how do therapists and doctors pool all of this data together to come up with a real plan to help people while recognizing the overwhelming prevalence of cannabis use in society?
This is a hard one, and as you can imagine, everybody's path away from drug problems is individualized. But I think what happens is if you send this wild message that one illicit drug is okay and another one is not, people are concerned that your clients might then sort of ease their way back into using hard drugs if they use one illegal drug. I think what this says is, gee, we need to separate the cannabis market from the hard drug market by, say, federal decriminalization, and then suddenly we don't have the same crazy expectations around cannabis that we have around some of the hard drugs. As many people will point out, too, folks who use alcohol in excess are at greater risk for relapsing to cocaine and other hard drugs, and it may be that some people just have to stay away from all drugs no matter what in order to stay away from hard drugs. Data that suggests that people can use one drug but still stay away from another are very hard to publish, and in some ways it's impossible to falsify that that's okay, because a lot of folks say, oh, don't worry, they're gonna relapse down the line, so they better stay away from everything no matter what. You can see how if we had this attitude about, eating or, depressive thoughts or things like that, it gets just a little bit too dichotomous, a little too black and white. And if we could get cannabis in this gray area of, okay, it's really not a hard drug, maybe we could experiment with the idea that people could use it intermittently. Some folks will rant and rave and scream that this is, the pathway back to relapse. But here we have some data suggesting that at least on the 14-week trial, it's not as evil as we thought.
Mitch, I want to thank you again for joining us here today, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Hey, thanks for taking on such a controversial topic.
Dr. Mitch Earlywine is professor of psychology at State University of New York and a member of NORML's advisory board. Mitch is the author of Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book, Pot Politics. We have links to the books at normalaudio-stash.com. We were discussing the newly published study, Concurrent Cannabis Use During Treatment for Comorbid ADHD and Cocaine Dependence, Effects on Outcome. It's published in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. In our daily news on Monday, we highlighted the case of a medical marijuana patient in Washington state, whose original conviction for possession of cannabis was upheld by the state Supreme Court. Joining us to discuss this case further is Jennifer Shaw, the Legislative Reform Coordinator at the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington. Jennifer, welcome to NORML's Daily Audio Stash today.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us today. We're talking about the Washington State Supreme Court ruling that upheld a marijuana possession charge against a medical marijuana patient, and this was because her treating physicians were located in California and Oregon. First, Jennifer, would it be common for a medical marijuana patient in Washington to have an out-of-state doctor?
It wouldn't be unusual. Washington borders on several other states, and especially on the Oregon border, there are a lot of large population cities where people can just as easily go across the border into Portland, Oregon, for instance, for treatment. So it isn't really all that unusual for people to have doctors who are out of state.
How did the justices come to the conclusion that the medical marijuana law in Washington, I-692, passed by 59% of voters, only applied to patients with in-state doctors?
The initiative talks about a physician licensed under a chapter of the Washington law, and It wasn't specific, you're correct, it wasn't specific about in-state or out-of-state. But what the court did was to interpret that law to say that the only way that an out-of-state physician could authorize the use or recommend the use of medical marijuana is if that doctor was in the state of Washington at the time that the recommendation was made. So if you went, for instance, if you lived in Oregon and had a doctor in Oregon who recommended the use of medical marijuana, and then you either moved to or came to visit for an extended period in Washington, you wouldn't be able to rely on that out-of-state doctor's recommendation.
And we also want to make clear that a recommendation from a doctor is not a prescription.
That's right. You can't prescribe marijuana at all because it's a Schedule I drug under the federal law, and so no physician anywhere in the country can actually prescribe marijuana for any purpose.
Now, Jennifer, what's the next step here so that medical marijuana patients in Washington don't have these convictions happen because their treating physician happens to be out of state?
We've been working with state legislators to try to make some reasonable changes and clarifications. I think one of the problems with an initiative is that when you change the law so significantly, it's really hard to predict all of the different consequences of those changes. And so what we'd like to do is to go back through the legislature now and to make some refinements and clarifications. One of the things that we want to do is to change the definition of a qualified physician to include any physician who's licensed anywhere in the country. If you're a validly licensed physician, you can practice medicine in any state, you should be able to recommend medical marijuana. And that should be sufficient for Washington law.
So this is really part of a broader process here, that when a ballot initiative is passed, it's not the be-all and end-all of an issue or a law. That proponents must continue to work with state governments to make these kinds of things actually work in practice for the people of the state.
Yeah, that's right. And we found a lot of support. The thing about medical marijuana is that it's hard to find somebody who hasn't had a friend or family member who's suffered from a debilitating disease or disorder that really can be made to feel better, at least, if not cured, by medical marijuana. And so we found a lot of support from a wide variety of legislators to make this law work, so that patients can be protected and can get the medication that they need.
We've seen a pretty large variety in California on how local governments have enacted medical marijuana laws. Is there a county-by-county difference in Washington as well?
There really is. It depends a lot on the leadership in that county, the prosecutor, the sheriff, any other local law enforcement. For example, in King County, where Seattle is located, the prosecutor's office has a policy of not going after medical marijuana patients unless there's really a good question about whether or not they are a valid patient. For instance, growing hundreds of plants might raise an eyebrow. Whereas in other counties, for instance, Skamania County, which is a more rural county in the southern part of the state, in that county where Ms. Tracy was staying with, I believe, with her mother, they had a different policy, and they did prosecute her even though she wasn't growing significant amounts. She just didn't, completely comply with every condition that's in the statute, and so they went ahead and prosecuted her.
So, Jennifer, working with the state legislature is really the only way to get medical marijuana laws put into action in any practical way, and also protect medical marijuana patients locally and visiting from out of state from harassment and possible arrest.
That's right, because otherwise you could go county by county and try to get policies changed, but those policies can be changed by electing a new prosecutor or having a new sheriff come into town. So it really is important that we get some statewide legislation in place to make sure that everyone is protected.
Jennifer, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to speaking with you again as you move forward on this in Washington.
Thanks so much.
Jennifer Shaw is the Legislative Reform Coordinator at the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington. We have links to the Washington State ACLU on our website at normalaudiostash.com. Next up today, we have some music found up at podshow.com. We have links to all the artists we play at normalaudiostash.com.
Wanna my favorite color of the rainbow. There's only one for me. The only color in the world that makes my day go like a dream. Green, I like green. Green, give me green. When I think of all the colors in my rainbow, there's only one for me. It's not a red, a blue, an orange, or a yellow. My rainbow's green. I like green. Green, give me green. I am green.
What do you know about my people smoking sensibility? What do you know about the war going on in our past? What do you know about the system with the peace of the peace? Say what you know about the source where your message is from. Propaganda warfare is going on. Propaganda warfare is going on. Propaganda warfare is going on. Propaganda warfare is going
Und lass den Fernseher lieber aus. Habe mich zurückgezogen in mein kleines, sicheres Haus. Ich beobachte Tag für Tag aus einer geschützten Position. Und was ich da sehe, das mag ich nicht. Ich glaub es nicht so. Du kannst mir erzählen, was du willst, solange du nur eine Seite kennst. Hast du keine Sicherheit, die andere als dein Feind zu nennen. Du musst dir schon die Mühe machen, beide Seiten zu verstehen. Dann kannst doch ohne Zweifel ein gerechtes Urteil bilden. Hast du Zweifel, dann glaub es nicht. Glaub es nur, wenn du sicher bist. Hast du Zweifel, dann glaub es nicht. Glaub es nur, wenn du sicher bist. Propaganda, Propaganda warfare, so propaganda. Propaganda warfare, so propaganda. Propaganda warfare, so propaganda. Propaganda warfare, so propaganda.
That was some fine music found at podshow.com. We have links to all the artists at normalaudio-stash.com. This has been NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Thanks to podshow.com for all the great pod-safe music. We feature the band Carne Cruda as our theme. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. Thanks to Red Aphid Interactive Media for the podcasting technology. We're back at 4:20 tomorrow. If you listen to the Audio Stash, cast your vote at Podcast Alley or other podcast directory services. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow. The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redaphid.com.